I'd like to welcome you back to my course on life writing and poetic autoethnography. In our last video, I described and we discussed different types of autoethnography, and in the video before that, we spoke about the more general characteristics of autoethnography. In this video, we're going to introduce the research method that we're going to be using in this course, which is poetic autoethnography. And to start off this process, I would like to explain something about how poetic autoethnography works before we get into the workshops which will operationalize this process. So, just to remind you, let's go back to a simple definition of autoethnography. Autoethnography is a research method that uses writing as a research methodology in order to investigate one's own personal experiences and what they mean. Poetic autoethnography is a very particular type of autoethnography, but what's special about it is that this is an autoethnography that uses the special features of poetry, writing, and reading in order to enhance insight, emotional clarity, and critical engagement with one's own personal experience. If you want to look at the research on this, I will at the end of this presentation give you a list of references that you can follow up with. So, of course, the question is now, what are the special features of poetry, and how do these special features interact with the process of reading and writing poetry? So let me give a set of 5 features that I think will help us to work through this process and understand how poetic autoethnography works. The first feature is one that you know well, I think, and that is that poetry is very condensed. So in a very short space of words, space of page, it's capable of conveying complex thoughts, experiences, and feelings. And that's a useful characteristic of poetry. The second one, and you'll see this will come into play throughout the process of the workshops, poetry is image-laden. It uses language that evokes, reflects, and appeals to the senses, and it's a very legitimate use of poetry. The third characteristic is, and this is actually a characteristic that a lot of people don't like about poetry, but actually I think it's probably the most important feature of poetry, and that is that poetry is clearly polysemantic. In other words, it has multiple potential meanings. So one image might have many associations tied to it, leading to many options for constructing meaning. Poetry is emotive. It reflects and elicits emotions, and that's why we use poetry at all sorts of ceremonies, such as inaugurations and so on. And finally, poetry is foregrounded. It brings linguistic creativity to the forefront and draws attention to itself. So what do these features do? So in a book I wrote called Poetry and the Meaning of Life, I pointed out 2 particular things. First of all, it explains the inexplicable. So it allows you to delve into the depths of human experience, touching upon emotions and ideas that defy easy explanation. In other words, there are a lot of things we experience in our life, but we don't really know what they mean. But poetry allows this ambiguity, confusion to be expressed in different ways. It also expresses the unexpressed. It provides a unique avenue for articulating thoughts and feelings that might otherwise remain hidden or ineffable. So let's talk about poetry reading and the processes and the way it works before we get into, in our next video, the actual methods of poetic autoethnography. And this is a quote from a paper I wrote. As I said, I'll give the references to this at the end of the lecture. The initial stages of poetry reading are highly influenced by the linguistic and textual structures of the poem. Linguistic and textual features are detected by the readers during the reading process, and they are used to categorize the text as a poem. Readers seem sensitive to the presence of linguistic and textual patterns in poetry, and these patterns produce aesthetic effects and enhance memory. Let's deal with this quote more as a process and sort of let me explicate the process of reading poetry. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying here, but I think it's a good enough description for what we're going to be doing as we move forward. So first of all, what characterizes, what people notice about poetry is its condensed, patterned language that looks different from prose, narrative, and other things. Technically, this is known as foregrounding. So the language is foregrounded. In the process of dealing with this foregrounded language, we get an emotive and polysemantic interaction, which is an emotive sensory response. Then we try to attempt to find meaning, we pay attention to the patterning, and finally, in our personal response, we produce a personal meaning and interpretation. Now let's deal with poetry writing. Poetry writing starts as a response to a series of potential triggers, such as real-world events, strong emotions and sensory images. The poem is initiated without a clear, formed understanding of its content and meaning or the described experience, thought, or feeling. It evolves through a process of drafting and revision, leading to a sense of discovery in which the insight into the original event and experience, thought, and feeling are revealed to the writer. I wrote this in a book called Poetry as Research, which established a basic process by which poetry can be used as research. So let's describe this more in a sort of process orientation. A lot of research has shown that poetry writing has two stages to it, and they're recursive. In other words, they happen one after the other, but also can come back in various different ways. So we have a generation stage, which involves language, play, free associations, wandering thought. In other words, we don't really know what we're doing, but we're generating language, ideas, images. And then we have a revision stage, in which we have deliberative thinking, aesthetic judgments, use of poetic features, and condensation, making it smaller. And between these two, we get a process of discovery. And in any poetry writing process, you might have a generation stage, a revision stage, another generation stage, yet another generation stage, yet another revision stage, another revision stage, and so on. So now let's talk about the poetic autoethnographic process. So let me go back a stage and say something that I said before. I don't like coherent life stories very much. And the reason I don't like coherent life stories is I don't believe them, because life isn't coherent. So if you look at this graph, we have multiple experiences that we live. We think some are important and some are not. And then we form a life story, and then we rehearse it, and we present it time after time after time, and it becomes a reality. But what is the reality? The reality is the rehearsed narrative and not the life experience itself. And it's a stable explanation of yourself, but it's also an untrustworthy explanation of yourself. When we construct the life stories, and you can go back to our initial videos in this course, we have a lived life, stored experience. We have established schema, habitus, if you like, social, cultural, and familial interpretations. We interpret those experiences, we put them into a life story, and then we rehearse the narrative time after time after time. What's the role of poetry in autoethnography? Well, first off, it provides direct access to emotive, image-laden description. Now, when we do that, and don't worry for a second how we do that, that's what the workshops are for, and it's a much easier process than I'm sure you're thinking at this moment. But through our poetic image writing process, taken for granted interpretive narrative explanations are countered. How does that happen? Well, it happens really for a very basic simple. You have an image, you transform your experience into an image. But then when you have an image is open to polysemantic interactions. In other words, instead of meaning one thing, which it has meant within your rehearsed narrative, now it's open to multiple meanings, and you can play with it and see where you go with it. And of course, it elicits emotions. I call this the destabilization of narrative process. And we will be modeling this through the workshops that come a bit later on. But basically, experience elicitation is one stage where we take the experience and use a sort of free writing process, which I will describe to you. And that movement of nonverbal information into verbal information in itself produces new understandings. And then we go through a clarification and specification of sensory and emotive aspects. We create an image. And between those two things, this leads to the option of a narrative recontextualization. In other words, a re-understanding of the narrative you're telling about your own experience. So if we go back to this model, you live your life, we elicit, through elicitation process, memorial traces, we create an image which is polysemantic, and then we discuss that image, and this involves a critical engagement with the rehearsed narrative that you have presented up until this point. These are the resources. You can stop the video. Most of these are open access, so that you can just download them from the web. Just put in the reference and you'll find them. And with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'll see you in our next video.